Hi everyone, welcome to my tutorial on Notion's if and ifs functions. These are really useful tools that let you add logic to your Notion databases. Think of them as ways to tell Notion, if this happens, do that. In this video, I'll cover the basics with two simple beginner examples, then move on to a more complex intermediate task management example. Let's start with the if function. This function checks a condition and gives you one result if it's true and another if it's false. For our first example, we have a database with two number properties, value 1 and value 2. Our goal is to check if the number in value 1 is the same as the number in value 2. Here's our database. Some rows have matching numbers and some don't. Let's create a formula to check this. Click to add a new property and set its type to formula. In the formula editor, type if brackets value 1 equals, and for equals you put two equal signs, value 2, comma, and I'm going to put yes, comma, and then no, and then close the brackets. To explain this, the if function has three parts. The first is a condition. In this example, this is checking if value 1 equals value 2. The second part of the function is what we get if the condition is true. In this case, if the values are equal, I want it to say yes. And the third part is what you get if the condition is false. So if the values are not the same, I want it to say no. Let's click save and see what happens. And it works. Where value 1 and value 2 match, we see yes, and where they don't, we see no. Simple but useful. Now let's move on to the ifs function, which is like the if function but lets you check multiple conditions in a row. Using a similar database, we want this formula to see if value 1 is less than, greater than, or equal to value 2. First, add a formula property, and in the formula editor, I'll type in if and select the ifs function. When you add a function, a description appears here, which is great if you have a bad memory like me and need a reminder of how to write the function. For the ifs function, I'm going to write the formula on different lines, so it's easier to read. To get a new line, use Shift and Enter. Let me write out the formula and then I'll explain how it works. The ifs function works by checking conditions in order. So it's kind of a list of if questions. So here, first it asks if value 1 is less than value 2. If it is, I've set it to show less than. And if it's not, it'll move on to the next line and check if value 1 is greater than value 2. If it is, it shows greater than. And at the end here is the value if none of the conditions are true. So the formula works through the list of conditions and stops when it reaches a true one. If none of them are true, it adds a default value. Let's click save and you can see that each row now tells us the relationship between value 1 and value 2. So it shows you if value 1 is less than, greater than, or equal to value 2. So this is quite a simple example of how to use the if function, but still very useful. In the next example, I'll show you a more complex list of conditions. Here I have a task database, and I want a formula to set a priority based on the task's status and due date. Here's what I want the formula to do, and you can see it's quite a long list. So I want to set it to completed if the task is done, set to no due date if the task doesn't have a due date set. I want it to say overdue if the task is not done and the due date is in the past. Set to today if the task is not done and the due date is today. And then I have a high priority, medium priority, and a low priority. And I've got one example of each in this database, so we'll be able to check that each is working as expected. Now, this is going to be a long formula, but I'll build it up step by step and check it's working as I go along. Let's start by working on the first condition and setting up the structure of the formula. I'll start by typing in ifs and adding a new line between the brackets, as I want to put each condition on a separate line, as it makes it easier to read. The first condition is to check if the due date is empty. For that, we use the empty function and pick the due date. Comma. So if it's empty, we want the formula to put no due date. And on a new line, I'll add empty speech marks. So if the due date is not empty, it'll just be blank. And let's check that that works. Yes, it does work, and you can see here we've put no due date for this record. Let's write the next condition. So if status equals done, comma, then I want it to say completed. Let's quickly see if that works as expected. Yes, it does, and it's put completed next to the done task. But what if a task is done and has no due date? It currently will say no due date. That's not what I wanted. I want it to say completed regardless of the due date. To fix that, you move the completed condition to the top, so it's checked first by the ifs function. The order of the conditions matter. The first matching one is used. Let me show you by switching around the condition, so it first checks if the task is completed, and if it's not, it'll then check if there's a due date. As you can see, the formula works as I want it to now. Okay, moving on to the next condition, I want to check if the task is not done and the due date is before today. For this, I'll use the date between function. This works out how many days between today and the due date. It'll return a minus number if the due date is before today. So after the date between function, I'll add less than 0. So it's saying if the due date is before today, set the value to overdue. Let's check this works. Yes, it does. Next, I'll finish by adding the due date today, low priority, medium priority, and high priorities. I'll use similar logic to the overdue condition and just adjust the number of days. I'll copy the overdue condition and change it to say if the date between today and the due date equals 0, then set the value to due today. I'll paste the condition in again, and this time for high priority, I want to say if the days to the due date are less than or equal to 3, set as high priority. Paste again, and if the days to due date is less than or equal to 7, I want to set it to medium priority. And finally, I'll change the default value to low priority. This will be all tasks that aren't completed and due in more than 7 days' time. Let's check it works. There isn't a high priority example, so I'll change this task so the due date is within 3 days, and yet the formula changes to high priority. To tidy things up, you can also use the let function to store the number of days to the due date as a variable. That way you only have to write out the date between function once. And this is what the formula would look like. It kind of tidies it up. You can also use the style function to color code the output for better visual clarity. For example, you can use a formula like this, and you'll get an output that looks more like a select property. Check out my let and style function tutorials to learn how to do this in more detail. This formula now automatically updates as the due date or status changes, keeping your task list prioritized and up to date. The more advanced uses of if formulas include using them in automations and buttons, which I'll cover in the advanced if tutorial.